Is it really necessary to upgrade the front control arm bushings on your MK6 GTI? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. Welcome to Crafty Workshop Builds. I upgraded the front control arm bushings on my MK6 GTI, and I want to talk about some of the benefits and the installation process and so on and so forth. One of the reasons why I chose to upgrade the bushings was because I wanted to improve the overall handling of the car. I already have coilovers and I already have upgraded sway bars, so I figured the next best thing to install was upgraded bushings. So that's what I did, and I felt like it did help with improving the overall handling of the car. While doing this upgrade, there's two possible problems that you could run into, and the first one is being able to successfully remove the control arm bolts, and the second one is being able to remove the bushings. If you don't have the proper tools to remove the bushings, that'll be a roadblock. Initially, when I tried to remove these bushings, I tried to remove the bushings using a hydraulic press, but I wasn't able to remove the bushings with the press. And it wasn't because the press wasn't strong enough to remove the bushings, it was just because I wasn't able to fit the control arms inside the press. Yes, these control arms, they have a weird shape, and because of that shape, it just wasn't allowing me to fit inside the press to have it properly aligned so I'm able to press it out. So instead, I used a bench vise. It's somewhat harder to use the bench vise to press the bushings out, but it is possible. One thing that you have to take into consideration is how wide your bench vise is able to open up. You have to have a bench vise that's able to open up wide enough to fit the control arm, as well as whatever tool you're going to use to press those bushings out. So take that into consideration. One thing that could make these bushings harder to remove is corrosion. On the larger bushings, which is in the control arm bracket, I noticed after I removed one of mine, it had a lot of corrosion on the inside. And when I removed the bushings on the other one, it didn't have any corrosion at all. But I noticed that the one that had the corrosion, that bushing was noticeably harder to remove than the one that didn't have any corrosion. The next possible problem that I'm going to address is the bolts. These bolts, they're torque to yield, and it's recommended that you replace them anytime you remove them. And that's because on the last step of the tightening process, these bolts, they actually get stretched. When I was removing the lower control arms on my car, I ended up breaking two bolts. And the worst part about me breaking these two bolts is that these two bolts weren't on the same side. It was one broken bolt on the left and the other broken bolt was on the right, which leads to me having to replace the subframe brackets on both sides of the car. So that's what I'm saying. Once you get these bolts out, just save yourself the headache and have them replaced. After I broke these two bolts, my first plan wasn't to just go ahead and replace the subframe brackets. I actually drilled and tried to extract these bolts, but these bolts, they were stuck. I wasn't able to get them out. So I was left with two options. The first option was reinstall everything with a missing bolt in the control arm brackets on each side, and I didn't want to do that, especially because my initial intent was to tighten the suspension. So having a missing bolt on each side of the car, it just didn't make any sense to me. So I went with the second option, which was to replace the subframe brackets, and that's what I did. Did I notice anything different after the install? Yes, I did. I noticed that the car felt slightly more planted to the road, and the steering wheel felt a little bit more stiff. One of the reasons why I believe I didn't feel any huge difference was because the stock bushings that I removed, they weren't in terrible shape, but nonetheless, it was a noticeable difference. The difference between the poly bushing and the stock rubber bushing is that the poly bushing is expected to last longer, and it's also stiffer. But one thing with the poly bushing is that it might increase the vibration in the front end of the car. But for me, it's not a big deal because my car is a project car. If your front lower control arms are currently bad and you're looking to replace them, now would be a good time for you to consider upgrading to the poly bushings. But that would also depend on the kind of car that you have, meaning, is your car a daily driver or do you have a project car? Because if you have a daily driver and everything on your car is stock and you don't really care too much about handling, you're probably going to be better off with just replacing it with the stock bushings. Whereas if you have a project car and you care a lot about handling, now would be a good time for you to upgrade with the poly bushings. If you do decide to upgrade to the poly bushings, you actually have two options. And the first option is for you to buy the control arms that already have the poly bushings installed in them. And that'll be a matter of you just removing the old control arms and reinstalling the new control arms with the poly bushings already installed in them. And that'll be it for that. But that's going to be more expensive. You can go with a cheaper option, which is buying the bushings by themselves and removing the old control arm and press out the old rubber bushings and press in the new poly bushings. But that's going to be more labor intensive, and it's going to require for you to have the tools. So you're going to have to make the decision if you want to go with something that's going to be cheaper but require a lot more labor and time, or do you want to go with something that's going to be more expensive but just easier to install. I went with the second option, and I made a step-by-step video of me removing the old rubber bushings and reinstalling the new poly bushings. I will have the video linked in the description below, so feel free to check it out if you haven't seen it already. Let me know in the comment section below if you still have the stock bushings in your car and you've been considering to upgrade to the poly bushings. So that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching and stay tuned.